Well, welcome to week 24 of the story. Who's the most famous person you've ever met? How did you feel? What were you thinking? What impact did it have on you? Now, as a freshman in college, I went with a number of friends to New York City to the NIT tournament when it was a significant tournament. One afternoon, when they weren't playing basketball, we were wandering the streets and going into the shops, and I went into FAO Schwarz, the toy store. Well, while I was there, I went to get on the elevator, and as I stepped on, there stood Red Skelton. Yeah, the comedian. I was dumbstruck, but you need to know that at my house, we watched him every week, and my dad probably, even if the president had been visiting, would have said, you know, we need to pause right here, sir. The Red Skelton's on TV, and we're going to watch that. And so anyway, as he was very gracious, I asked him for an autograph, and he took a big old, looked like a first grade pencil. You remember those big things, pulled it out of his pocket, signed an autograph for me. Asked me about my family, and I told him about our ritual of watching him every week, and he just kind of laughed and chuckled at that, asked me about my mom and dad, and I told him I had a sister and what our ritual was. And then I said, sir, how long are you going to be here? And he said, well, you'd be there a while. I said, well, look, I've got friends here. They would never believe that I'd met you, and I want to go find them and bring them just so there will be some validity to what I tell them. And he said, well, go ahead. And said, I'll be here a while. So I went out, found my friends, and when I came back, he was there on the first floor as we walked in. And he looks and he yells and he says, Robin, come here. How's your family? How's your sister? How are things going on? He acted like he was a family friend. He didn't tell my friends that we had just met, and neither did I. And I may guess maybe to this day, they still believe Red Skelton was a family friend of ours. Well, I also had the privilege and honor of traveling with Bill Bright, the founder of Campus Crusade for Christ. He had a profound impact on my life. He modeled the way we should live by faith. Important people. You see, your life is impacted when you meet extraordinary people. And they don't have to be famous folks, but just extraordinary, and your life is impacted. Jesus was no ordinary teacher. And tonight in the story, we're going to take a look at some of what he taught. The crowd's reaction at the end of Jesus' most famous sermon, that Sermon on the Mount, found in Matthew chapters 5 through 7, reflect the idea that Jesus was no ordinary teacher. Because at the end of that chapter, chapter 7, it says this, and when Jesus finished these sayings, the crowds were astonished at his teaching, for he was teaching as one who had authority, not as their scribes. Now, Jesus was called rabbi. In the New Testament, the term rabbi meant teacher or master. It was specifically used of a man schooled in the law of Moses. Each rabbi had developed their own interpretations of the law. They would gather followers around them who would be devoted to their teaching and then continue to teach it to others. Each rabbi would have disciples who would follow after them and learn from them. The rabbi's teaching, get this, was called a yoke. To come under a rabbi's teaching was to take on his yoke. Now think about what Jesus did. In his ministry, he first called disciples to follow him, to learn from him. The disciples called Jesus Master, they called him Lord, they called him Rabbi, signifying their respect for him. But let me show you how this understanding of a rabbi's teaching is important to you and to me. Matthew chapter 11, you know these words, don't you? He said, come unto me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me. For I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your soul. For my yoke is easy, my burden is light. You see, Jesus is calling us to follow him and his teaching. Now, Jesus used many methods to teach. He used sermons, like the one we referred to, the Sermon on the Mount, and those most often contain direct commands. he also used parables. This is where he used everyday common things to teach spiritual truths. The lost sheep, the Good Samaritan are examples of parables. He set an example for the disciples to follow, the way he lived. He also taught them to pray. But the core of Jesus' teachings, I believe, are found in what I call and what have been called the three great commandments, statements. The great commandment, the great criteria, and the great commission. These three give us what he taught, how we're to live it out, and then where we're to live it out. These reveal Jesus' core values, I believe, and his core commitments. It is in these three statements that we see just how radical and extraordinary Jesus' teachings were, and they still are today. What I want to do is real quickly to look at each of those three statements and how Jesus emphasized them in his teaching. So let's look at these great statements. First, the great commandment. You know, here it is. It comes out of one place, is in Mark chapter 12, starting in verse 28. It says, "And one of the scribes came up and heard them disputing with one another, and seeing that he answered them well, he asked, which commandment is the most important of all? And Jesus answered, the most important is, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, with all your strength. The second is this, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. There is no other commandment greater than these." These two commandments come from Deuteronomy chapter 6 and from Leviticus chapter 19. But this is the first time that they are used together. Here Jesus ties loving God and loving others together. Jesus holds this foremost in his teaching, and he uses it, I think, as a linchpin for all of his teaching. Everything will come back to these two. Here Jesus uses direct challenge and parables to teach and emphasize the truth. He challenges directly the hypocrisy of the scribes and Pharisees, the religious leaders. In the woe to you statements in Matthew chapter 23, Jesus calls them dirty dishes and whitewashed tombs, clean on the outside, but dirty and full of death on the inside. When challenged by religious leaders for eating and associating with sinners, people they would never think of even speaking with, much less eating with, Jesus told three parables found in Luke chapter 15. We call these the lost parables, the lost sheep, the lost coin, and the lost son. And Jesus reminds these religious leaders that these are the ones he came for, and they're important to God. We search for them until we find them, just like we would looking for one of the lost items he described. He gave them a direct command in Matthew 6, and you know this verse, verse 33. But seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added to you. His teaching challenged their selfishness, their self-centeredness of the people, and reminded them that life is about worshiping the Father and not about me or them. Second is the great criteria. You're familiar with the passage. It's in Matthew chapter 25. It says, "Then the king will say to those on his right, Come you who are blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me food, and I was thirsty and you gave me drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you visited me. I was in prison and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? Or when did we see you a stranger and welcome you, naked and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you?" And the king will answer them, "Truly I say to you, when you did it to the least of these, you did it to me." Jesus tells us this is not about those who are comfortable being, that we are comfortable being around, or those just like me. he stretches me and he says it's about the least of these, those who cannot do for themselves. I am to live out my loving God and others by serving those who need it the most and receive it the least. To the least of these, those others would leave out. You live out your faith by serving those who cannot repay. Risk your reputation, standing with your friends and befriend and welcome and invite the outsiders. Jesus told the story of the Good Samaritan. When the religious people refused to help, the Samaritan helped even though he was despised by the Jews. Are you catching just how radical Jesus' teachings are? Wow. The Great Commandment, the Great Criteria, and third, the Great Commission. You know that from Matthew 28. And Jesus came to them and said, all authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit, teaching them to observe all that I've commanded you. And behold, I am with you always to the end of the age. Here Jesus gives us the where we are to live out his teachings. We are to take his teachings to all the world, to make disciples or followers of Jesus, teaching them what we have learned from him. The yoke, remember? He teaches all, that all who come to him will be received. In John chapter 6, says that all the Father gives to me shall come to me, and whoever comes to me, I will not cast out. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. You see, in this he assures us that his presence and power will be ever present with us. The core of his teaching is found in these three statements: the Great Commandment, the Great Criteria, and the Great Commission. But Jesus also taught us to pray. The disciples asked him how to pray, and he gave them the Lord's Prayer. It's a prayer for disciples to pray, those committed to following Jesus. Let me close with these thoughts on the Lord's Prayer. It comes from an unknown author. It says this: I cannot say our if I'm only by myself. I cannot say Father if I do not endeavor each day to live like his child. I cannot say who art in heaven if I'm laying up treasure here. I cannot say hallowed be thy name if I'm not striving for holiness. I cannot say thy kingdom come if I'm not doing all in my power to hasten that wonderful event. I cannot say thy will be done if I am disobedient to his word. I cannot say in earth as it is in heaven if I'll not serve him here and now. I cannot say give us this day our daily bread if I'm dishonest and seeking for things by subterfuge. I cannot say forgive us our debts if I harbor a grudge against anyone. I cannot say lead us not into temptation if I deliberately place myself in its path. I cannot say deliver us from evil if I do not put on the whole armor of God. I cannot say thy kingdom, thine is the kingdom, if I do not give the king the loyalty due him from a faithful subject. I cannot attribute to him the power if I fear what men may do to me. I cannot ascribe to him the glory if I'm seeking to honor only myself, and I cannot say forever if the horizon of my life is bound completely by time. Jesus taught his disciples so that they could teach others, and on and on and on. His teachings would go through the ages. His teachings will radically change lives, and that includes you. And now that's a story worth knowing and telling. Enjoy Randy Frazee and the discussion to follow.